Good evening and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam and I'll be your moderator. We're excited to welcome Marty Santizo as our speaker tonight, as she will discuss the science of whitening. Tonight's webinar is also sponsored by Colgate. Before we get started, we have a few reminders. At any point during the webinar, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A section of your control panel and we'll get back to you via email within 2 business days. And Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation, live or on demand. Marty, thanks for being with us.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Marty Santizo. I am a dental hygienist and currently work for Colgate as a professional education manager. And I would like to thank Henry Schein for this opportunity to be able to speak about the next generation of the science of whitening. So as you're very well aware, whitening in modern days has been around for probably about 30 years now. Very familiar with the custom tray that's shown here. And but if you think about it, the whitening process has really not changed too much in the past 35 years. It's always been an aqueous-based viscous gel that is applied to the teeth, either with a hydrogen peroxide or a carbamide peroxide. That's certainly not true with other industries from the 1980s. If you look at some of these technologies, you know, in the very far distant past, you might remember having this type of phone or a boom box. I can't even remember the last time I looked at a paper map in my car, because all of that has been now upgraded to even just one device that we have in the palm of our hand. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of whitening and a little bit about what the opportunity is for your practice. It's always good to talk about the advantages and disadvantages, and then I'd like to get into the science of whitening, how it actually works, and then I'll introduce to you some new options. And once you have the new options in your hand, then we can talk about the professional advantages to you by starting a whitening program in your office. So the history, you know, I'm not going to get too much into the history, but the history has been around, you know, whitening has been done for thousands of years, really. The ancient Romans used goat's milk in a paste that was made from urine, and they found that the ammonia from the urine was actually what caused the whitening. But even in ancient Rome, the ancient Greeks, you know, they all valued whitening because they felt like, you know, the whiter your teeth were, the more successful you appeared to be, the more wealthy you appeared to be, the more powerful. And that really hasn't changed in all these years. Commercial whitening, you know, in modern days began around the mid to 1980s. And there are several different methods of whitening that are on the market now. There's, you know, over-the-counter whitening, there's custom trays, there's in-office whitening, and you know, millions, I would even say billions of dollars, $11 billion and growing is the market for whitening. There's a lot of people who have tried whitening, over-the-counter whitening products, and they still want whiter teeth. So this is a huge opportunity for us as dental professionals to be discussing whitening with our patients. A lot of times, if we are not the ones to instigate that conversation, then our patients will go to what I call Dr. Google. And Dr. Google has some great information, but it's not always evidence-based information. So it's really important that we speak with our patients about whitening so that they can get the very best options, the most scientific, evidence-based options for them. So let's talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages. We know that with every dental procedure that we do in our office, there's going to be advantages and there's going to be disadvantages. So it's important that we explain the advantages and disadvantages to our patients so that they can make a really good informed decision about whatever procedure we are speaking to them about. What are some of the advantages of whitening? Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, you're going to have whiter teeth, and we already talked about how in society, you know, the effect of whiter teeth, people tend to think that they're going to be more beautiful. It is kind of a power symbol, a wealth symbol, a success symbol. And so all of those are advantages. And patients, as I said previously, they're looking. There are many, many patients who are looking to whiten their teeth. But just like any other dental procedure, there's also disadvantages. Some of those disadvantages have to do with what the patient views as a disadvantage, and that could be something like sensitivity. It could be the wear time. I had patients who said, I want my teeth to be white yesterday. Like they don't want to have to go through a lengthy period of time to be, that procedure to take a long time. The sensitivity issue is actually quite large. There's a larger number of patients who experience sensitivity during bleaching. When I first saw this 78%, I was a little bit surprised because I worked as a clinician for many, many years in a prosthodontic office where we did a lot of bleaching. And I don't remember that high of a number of patients coming back and complaining about sensitivity. But then I started thinking about it because I realized that a lot of people perceive beauty as, in order to get a beautiful treatment or treatments for beauty, you're going to have to undergo pain. So they equate beauty with pain. I've even heard a lot of women say, beauty is pain. And, there's a lot of women out there who wear those little pointy-toed shoes or go through some extremely painful procedures because they feel like it's going to enhance their beauty. And so they're willing to put up with pain and maybe not complain about it so much. But there is a large number of patients who do experience sensitivity with whitening. And you may even come across people who would like to whiten their teeth, but they shy away from it because it can be so sensitive. So as dental professionals, we know that there are lots of ways that we can kind of combat and help our patients who are having sensitivity. There are desensitizing protocols. There are actually bleaching solutions available now that contain potassium nitrate, which we know sedates the nerve and calms it down. But we know that all of these options, the potassium nitrate, stabilized stannous fluoride, will actually block the tubules, kind of plug them up, seal them off so that they're not getting sensitivity. But all of these take a couple of weeks, up to even 4 to 8 weeks, to really completely desensitize the tooth. So as we know, a lot of times the whitening procedure only takes a couple of weeks. So by the time the patient is done with the whitening procedure, that's when the desensitizing starts to kick in. So that's not super helpful while the patient is desensitizing. And actually there was a study that came out in the Journal of the American Dental Association about 2 years ago, around this time of year. And they were looking at analgesics that dentists prescribe to patients to help with bleaching sensitivity. And they found that the analgesics really did not have any effect at all on sensitivity due to bleaching. So a lot of these things that we think are helping our patients are really not helping as much as we think. There are pre and post whitening treatments that we can do, but if they have to wait for several weeks for it to take effect, they're, it kind of deflates their enthusiasm for the whitening process. But then there's also new bleaching options that are available that we're going to talk about today. So we know that currently whitening is not a pain-free process. There's the dentin hypersensitivity that happens because of bleaching. And we've already talked about how that can be a barrier to even some patients, or it can make it so that the patients are not as compliant, because if they start and then they start to develop sensitivity, they're not going to want to continue their treatment. Then there's always the inconvenience and the mess. Whitening trays are messy. It's goopy, it's viscous, it sticks to the teeth, it sticks to the tray, and patients are having to, clean it out. And then, while they're doing the treatment, there's a lot of excess hydrogen peroxide that's getting into the mouth. So they're tasting it. They're drooling excessively. They're getting, even sometimes they're getting gingival irritation or burns. And it can be a little bit of an inconvenience and a mess and a little bit painful at times that way. And then we know that it's time consuming. The options that we have available to us now can be a wear time of anywhere from 15 minutes up to an hour and a half, and even for some patients, overnight bleaching. And so it's a lot of time that they have to put in, and they're wearing that like that for 2 weeks up to many weeks. And we know that anytime there is something that's uncomfortable in the process, the patient compliance will decrease. So what are some of the disadvantages for the dental professionals? We know that tray fabrication can take a long time. You know, the patient could be sitting in the chair waiting for that tray, or they may have to go home and then come back. So it's an additional appointment that you're using to put a warm body in. And I know that we need to be aware as dental professionals that time is money. Every single minute that our patient is sitting in our chair, that's taking up chair time. And so we have to calculate that in. It can take anywhere, you know, like I said, I performed many whitening procedures in my lifetime. And I would say from start to finish, by the time you take the impressions, do the border molding, making sure everything is okay, and as long as the patient doesn't vomit, you know, all of those things taken into consideration, and then going back and pouring up the model, and then waiting for the model to dry, and then trimming the model, you know, doing the suck down tray, trimming the trays. I mean, the whole procedure can take anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half of the dental professional's time. So that's either chair time that's being taken up, or even paying an assistant or a hygienist or someone in the office to fabricate that tray. Then you have to take into consideration the chair time. Once you deliver that tray to the patient, you have to make sure that they understand how to use it. Sometimes you will actually do the first treatment in the chair so that they understand how it's to be used. And then you have to spend some time explaining the bleaching process and even managing patient expectation, which can take a little bit of time. I know I had patients who would come in and they would point to the countertop, which was about the color of the back of this PowerPoint. So it was a nice bright white countertop, and they would point to that countertop and they would say, Marty, I want my teeth to be this color when we get done. So you kind of have to go like, okay, let's roll back here and talk about this a little bit. And I would discuss with them, you know, how there's a certain population, a small population that will not bleach at all. So hopefully you're not part of that population, but everybody has a predisposed DNA to, you know, not everybody's going to get the same color of white because of our DNA. And I would liken it to the process of a tanning salon. So if someone with nice olive skin goes into the tanning salon and says, how dark am I going to get in 5 minutes in the tanning booth? It's going to be a completely different answer than someone who has red hair and very pale skin goes in. You know, they may not even get tan, they might burn and then peel and come back out just as white as what they started. So it's the same way with our teeth. So we have to talk to our patients and help to kind of manage that expectation, and all of that takes some time. So how does whitening work? We know that the color of teeth is influenced by a combination of both intrinsic stains, or the intrinsic color of the dentin, and then extrinsic stains, or the color that is sitting on top of the enamel. So we know that enamel is translucent in color, and so a lot of the color of the tooth that shines through is coming from the dentin, but there can also be extrinsic stains that can affect the tooth color as well. So we know that extrinsic stains can come from foods and things that we drink, coffees, teas, red wines, tobacco stain. All of these are so fun to remove when our patients come in for a prophylaxis. And even chlorhexidine, which as a hygienist, I have a real love-hate relationship with chlorhexidine gluconate, because we know that even though it's a great antimicrobial, it can also give some pretty heavy-duty stains to the teeth that are quite tenacious. So all of these are located on the outside of the tooth. And actually there are over-the-counter whitening products. So you may go to the drugstore and see all kinds of whitening toothpaste that are available over the counter. And then when you look at the back at the active ingredients, you'll notice that many of them do not contain any form of hydrogen or carbamide peroxide, no peroxides. But what this does is the FDA has said that they have approved that if a toothpaste can remove extrinsic stains, then it can be advertised as a whitening toothpaste. So whitening doesn't necessarily mean bleaching. So some of these extrinsic stains can be removed with a professional prophylaxis. Maybe some of them can be removed a little bit with some of the whitening toothpaste. There's actually a few whitening toothpaste out there that do contain a bleaching component, and the Colgate Optic White toothpaste that's available on the market actually has the highest amount of hydrogen peroxide at 3% for their toothpaste. Then there are intrinsic stains that are located inside the tooth, down in that dentin. And we know that as the tooth is forming, if a patient has tetracycline or too much fluoride, then that can create quite a darkened effect on the teeth. Aging can also affect the color of the teeth. We know that as we age, we lay down more secondary dentin, so the pulp gets smaller and smaller. And the more dentin we have, the thicker the dentin, the darker the tooth appears. So as you get older, your teeth, instead of having that yellow, orange, brown stain, it tends to look more like a blue-gray stain, which those stains are a little bit tougher to remove. You'll notice that I have tobacco listed both on the extrinsic side and on the intrinsic side, because we know that if tobacco stain sits on the tooth over a long period of time, it can actually penetrate down through those enamel rods and become an intrinsic stain. And then with age, like we were talking about, actually with the tooth vitality, I'm sorry, I was getting confused with age, but tooth vitality, we know that if the tooth dies, it can become quite dark. A lot of times there'll be, it'll affect the pulp, and so there will be bleeding up into those dental tubules. But all of these things can affect the dentin color, that intrinsic color of the tooth. So I just want to talk a little bit about shades, and when you're taking shades in your office, and especially when you're using shade guides for bleaching procedures. As you're very well aware, this is the Vita Shade Guide. And the Vita Shade Guide was first brought into dentistry to help dental professionals as the porcelains started to be utilized. So with crowns, bridges, all of the fixed and removable prosthetics that we do. And so the original Vita Shade Guide, as you can see from the top, was sectioned off according to chroma. So you're looking at the color of the tooth, and then within each chroma, it goes from lightest to darkest. So the value is from the lightest to the darkest in the red-brown shade for the A's, from lightest to darkest in the red yellows for the B's, and then on down through the grays and the red grays. So it's great for when you are doing restorative, because you're looking at the chroma and then you're going to see what the value is within that chroma. However, I would recommend that if you are doing a lot of bleaching in your office and you have an operatory that you have specific for the bleaching procedure, I would recommend that you have a Vita Shade Guide that instead of having it according to chroma, that you place it according to value. So you can see on the lower where we have rearranged the Vita Shade Guide according to value. So it's going from the lightest shade to the darkest shade, and we are not really taking into account the chroma. Because when you are looking, when you're talking about shade changes with bleaching, the patient isn't super concerned about chroma, but they want to see how dark their teeth were when they started and how light they ended up. And if you use it in that with the top Vita Shade Guide, if you use that protocol, then it's a little bit hard because it doesn't go from lightest to darkest. So I would recommend that you change at least one of your Vita Shade Guides and have that in your bleaching operatory, so that when your patients come in and you're ready to take a shade, like let's take, for instance, Mrs. Jones comes in. Mrs. Jones, when she comes in, if you use the traditional shade guide, she was an A3. Well, on either of these shade guides, she would be an A3. Then she pays whatever it is that you charge for your whitening, for your bleaching material. She takes it home, wears it for 2 weeks, comes back after a couple of weeks, and now Mrs. Jones is an A1. Wow, Mrs. Jones, that's great. What that appears to Mrs. Jones, though, is that she had 2 shade changes. So if you have spent, think about the amount of money that you charge for your bleaching procedures in your offices. And if you personally had spent that amount of money and then come back and had what appeared to be only 2 shade changes, I don't know how happy you would be with the amount of money that you spent. It can be anywhere from a couple of $100 up to even $500 for the take-home bleaches across the country. But if you have this according to value, let's look at Mrs. Jones again. Mrs. Jones, once again, when she came in, she was an A3, if you remember. When she came back, she was an A1. So now when you are showing Mrs. Jones according to value, can you see how much better they're going to have their expectation met by just looking at value instead of including the chroma? Because now you can say, Mrs. Jones, you just had 7 shade changes. And in reality, she had 7 shade changes all along. But if it only appears to be 2, she's going to be much more disappointed than if it appears to be 7. Let's look at Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones comes in and he's a C4 on the Vita Shade Guide. He comes back after a couple of weeks and he's a B2. Wow, Mrs. Jones, that appears to be 6 shades that you changed. But let's look at this according to value. Mr. Jones, when he came in, he was a C4, like we already said. If you look at this according to value, Mr. Jones can see that he's at the very bottom of the darkness scale. And so when he comes back, he's a B2, same shades. But now when you're showing Mr. Jones, it actually appears on value that he has changed 13 shades. Mr. Jones is going to be a lot more excited about 13 shades than 6 shades. So I really recommend that you start to utilize this according to value with your bleaching patients. So we know that with the intrinsic stains, we only have a couple of treatment options. We can either bleach the teeth with peroxide, either hydrogen peroxide or carbamide peroxide, or we can do a restorative procedure and cover up the staining. And I can say that working in this prosthodontic office, we did a lot of covering up, especially patients with tetracycline stains or fluorosis. We would have to do a full mouth rehab. And sometimes if it's a tetracycline patient, that's what they want because they don't want to have to bleach overnight with a low percentage of carbamide peroxide in a tray overnight for many, many months. So let's just take a look at the chemistry of hydrogen peroxide and carbamide peroxide. You can see from this slide that hydrogen peroxide is a much smaller molecule, and carbamide peroxide is much bigger and more complex. But if it breaks down, it actually, you can see on that right-hand side, the little tail is actually hydrogen peroxide. So if you look at the process a little bit more closely, you can see that hydrogen peroxide, as it breaks down into urea and hydrogen peroxide. So it takes a little bit longer for that process to happen because it has to break down more. Once it gets broken down into the urea and the hydrogen peroxide, then the hydrogen peroxide molecule can break down into water and a reactive oxygen. So if you're using carbamide peroxide, you have to have a higher percentage to be the same as the hydrogen peroxide because we're breaking out the urea and then we're just working with what's left with the hydrogen peroxide. So you can see from this chart that hydrogen peroxide starts to break down very quickly, and within about an hour to an hour and a half, the majority of it has broken down and been utilized. Carbamide peroxide, on the other hand, because it has to break down into urea and then hydrogen peroxide and then break down again, it takes quite a bit longer. And sometimes that is considered like a sustained release type of formulation. So a patient can wear it for many, many hours and it will continue to lighten the teeth. But when you're comparing hydrogen peroxide to carbamide peroxide, you're not comparing apples to apples. So it's very important when whoever comes in to talk to you about new whitening systems in your office, that you have a clear understanding whether or not they are talking about carbamide peroxide or hydrogen peroxide. So if you are talking about a hydrogen peroxide, I know many times when I would work at a trade show, I used to actually work for a whitening company and I would hand out a new product that was a hydrogen peroxide and it was maybe a 10% and I would try to give it away to a dental professional and they'd say, oh no, I want something much higher. I'm used to using 20 or 30%. And then you'd have to explain, well, it's a hydrogen peroxide, so you have to multiply it by 3 to be comparable to a carbamide peroxide. And then their eyes would light up and they'd say, oh yeah, well, give me a bunch of samples. So really understand, if you're learning about a new whitening product, understand if you're talking about carbamide peroxide or hydrogen peroxide, and then you need to do the math in your head. So a couple of things that I want you to understand about the hydrogen peroxide molecule, and that is that it is very, very tiny. As a hygienist, I'm very familiar with millimeters. If somebody says, something is 2 or 3 millimeters, I can picture in my mind that size. But when you start talking about micrometers and picometers, that kind of blows me away a little bit. So the enamel prisms, the space between enamel prisms is about 1/10 of a micrometer. Hydrogen peroxide molecules, on the other hand, are measured in picometers. And there's about 1 million picometers in 1 micrometer. So now we're talking about infinitesimal smallness here. So what I thought would be interesting to do is to do a little math and change micrometers to miles and picometers to inches. So when we did this, we converted it. Now we're looking at 150 inches compared to 2 miles. So if any of you have been to Manhattan Island in New York, you will know that it's about 2 miles wide, and it's surrounded on either side by 2 rivers. So there's the East River on one side and the Hudson River on the other side. So this is like, the rivers are like enamel rods, if you can picture that in your mind. Those are the enamel rods, and the land mass that's about 2 miles wide would be like the space between the enamel rods. Then if you were to take 150 inches, that's like 2 city buses. So if you can imagine 2 city buses side by side and measured across the back of those 2 city buses, that would be about 150 inches. So now you're going to take these 2 city buses, and you can see that in 2 miles, they have a lot of space, because we're taking all of the cars out of New York City right now. And we just have these buses, and you can see that they can bounce around on that landmass with no problem. And they're not going to fall into either of the rivers, because those are the, in our mind, those are the enamel rods. So if you think of that as the hydrogen peroxide going down between those enamel rods, they have lots and lots of space to play down in there. And the bleaching actually takes place down between the enamel rods, and even at this dentino-enamel junction, where it will tend to spread out and start to do its work. So here's just a little visual. This is a chromophore. The carotene molecule is the color molecule found in carrots. So we know that the chromophores have a lot of double bonds. So if you think back to your chemistry, you can see all these double bonds across here. And double bonds impact the color. So if you have the hydrogen peroxide, we know that it breaks down into hydrogen peroxide and the reactive oxygen. And it's the reactive oxygen that does all of the heavy lifting. What it does is it goes in and breaks up the double bonds in the chromophores. So those double bonds, the single bonds are less colored and they reflect less light, making the tooth appear lighter. So let's just talk a little bit about some new options. We already know that patients want to whiten, and their motivations may be different. Maybe one person is getting a new job, another person is getting married, maybe another person is getting divorced and wanting to get out into the field again. And so there's a lot of different motivations for whitening, but everybody kind of wants the same thing. First of all, they want a whitening that's really going to work. They don't want to go through this whole procedure only to find out that it didn't work. They want it to be easy and effortless. They don't want it to be messy. They don't want it to be painful. They don't, all of these things, they just want it to be easy, fast, no pain, and be done and have whiter teeth. Well, we've known for many years that we can enhance hydrogen peroxide. We can either increase the percentage of hydrogen peroxide. So we know that, you're going to get more whitening if you have a 10% carbamide peroxide and then you up it to a 30% carbamide peroxide, or if you have a 5% hydrogen peroxide as opposed to a 10% hydrogen peroxide. So the higher the percentage of the peroxide, we know that the whitening will be enhanced. Also, the more time that the patient wears it on their teeth will enhance the whitening process. For many years, there has been differing thought about lights and whether lights will enhance the whitening process, or heat will enhance the whitening process. And for many years, the blue lights have been utilized in dentistry. So, and it's interesting because they have found that now that if you have a lower wavelength, if you go down into the purple wavelengths, that you can actually enhance the whitening process. So it's interesting because I think, you know, over the years, there's been a lot of studies on the blue lights and whether or not they work. And I think there's a kind of a common feeling in dentistry that it's more of a gimmick. And, you know, but they'll buy it, they'll utilize it in their office just because the patients asked for it. So why are we going to stay the same? You know, like we talked about earlier, all the other technology around us is changing. So let's look at some new technology with bleaching. So here we have a new technology. It just came out on the market just the beginning of October. That is powerfully fast, very fast whitening. There is literally no mess. It's very easy to use, and it's designed for no sensitivity. So you can see that it has two components. So we have two very powerful platforms that are very different than anything that you've seen on the market so far. Like I said in the past, we've always had a viscous aqueous-based gel. Now, this is a patented product that is not aqueous-based. It's actually alcohol-based, and it's a serum instead of that thick viscous gel. It is designed for no sensitivity, and it's very, very fast acting, very precise placement on the tooth. And because it is alcohol-based, the alcohol evaporates very rapidly, and you are left with a polymer that holds the hydrogen peroxide up against the tooth. Then with the light, as I said, is very different than the blue light that's always been around for whitening. This is a purple light, which has a shorter wavelength and delivers higher energy to the tooth. It's a rechargeable device, and so it will consistently deliver a stable output. So let's just look at the light for a minute, because we're very familiar with the blue lights that are out on the market, and they range anywhere from 450 to 460 nanometers. But we have found that if you reduce the number of nanometers, if you bring it down into that purple spectrum, that you are going to have, even though it's a lower wavelength, we know that the lower the wavelength, the higher the energy. And so you can actually increase the penetration of the hydrogen peroxide with that higher energy light. Here's just a little diagram that shows the difference between the lower energy lights that are in the blue range and the high energy lights that are in the 400, 410 nanometer range. So you can see that it's a shorter wavelength, but it is much higher energy. So there's much more energy that's delivered to the tooth to enhance the whitening. This is just a picture of the Colgate light device in the middle compared to a couple of the competitors. So you can see very distinctly that it's in the purple range instead of the blue range. And if you notice on this mouth guard, this device, that there are like 700 or more light LED lights in that purple range, and they are covering the whole facial surface. So they're working very nicely on the whole surface of the tooth at that shorter wavelength for increased penetration. Let's just talk a little bit about the serum. The serum is also very different. The serum, as I said, is alcohol-based. It's in an alcohol, so inside of this pen, it is in a liquid form, but as soon as you paint it on, it's very precise paint that you just put onto the tooth. I liken it kind of to, if you're, you know, if you're a woman, you're very familiar with applying fingernail polish to your fingers. Same idea, very precise placement. And it goes from a liquid to an evaporated solid. So that polymer that's in there actually holds the hydrogen peroxide up against the tooth, and it cannot be removed with saliva or your lip action. So your tongue or lip action cannot remove it. Water does not remove it. So it's just sitting right there on the tooth. I'm just going to show you here on this top video. It shows the precise placement. And you can see this is in real time how quickly this evaporates. So in less than 10 seconds, that has gone from a liquid to a solid. So now you have a thin polymer film on the teeth that holds the hydrogen peroxide right up against the tooth. Because it's such a precise placement, you can keep it away from the gingival margin. The patient can keep it away from any exposed dentin along that cervical third. And so it makes it so that there's very little, if no sensitivity. The next one down here below, you can see that they've painted it on a dark surface and it's sped up. But what I want to show you with this particular video is how you have to remove it with a bristle, like a toothbrush. It cannot be removed with just saliva or water or even lip and tongue action. So I just wanted to show you with this diagram how you paint it onto the tooth, onto the enamel, and you can see that the amount, is 100% of the amount is on the tooth. But as that formula, as that serum evaporates, now you have a very, very thin coating on the tooth. So I want to liken it to, if any of you are cooks and you like to make a reduction sauce, you'll know that you put the sauce in the pan and then you evaporate a lot of the liquid. So once you evaporate that liquid, you end up with a more concentrated sauce, correct? It intensifies the flavors. And that is what happens on the tooth. So it's a 6% hydrogen peroxide, but as that alcohol evaporates, that 6% hydrogen peroxide acts as a much higher concentration of hydrogen peroxide. Same idea if you had a cup of coffee and a full cup, and then you put 6 cubes of sugar in your cup of coffee. It would taste nice and sweet. It would be really yummy. But then if you let that coffee evaporate over time, and then you ended up with just half a cup of coffee, you would still have those 6 cubes of sugar in that coffee cup. So now it would taste even more sweet than it did when you started, because now it has been concentrated. This is just going to show you the application of this serum. So inside you have the ethanol alcohol, the polymer, and the hydrogen peroxide. 6% hydrogen peroxide, 94% of the other components. Now we're going to place that serum onto the tooth. And you will be able to see that a lot of the alcohol, all of the alcohol will evaporate very quickly. And because there's a low surface tension, it spreads out over the whole base of the tooth. As the alcohol evaporates, then you'll notice that you are left with the polymer and the hydrogen peroxide. So now we've reduced the other components in the tooth, so the peroxide diffuses into the tooth and actually acts as a more concentrated form of peroxide, because there's a lot of the components have now been removed. So you start with a 6%, but it becomes more concentrated as you remove the inactive elements. So here's how you use this. You're going to start with the pen. You want to dry the teeth. I believe the instructions say to wipe it with wipe maybe the upper with a tissue. I do it quadrant by quadrant. And instead of wiping with a tissue, I just do this. And it dries the teeth, so you're no puddles, and then you're going to apply the serum. So the first time you use the serum, you have to prime it a little bit. So you prime the brush. So you might have to click 20, 30 times, but then after that, it has now been primed and it really only takes 1, maybe 2 clicks. So this little area down below is just like a pen. You click it like a pen, and you'll notice that you'll get a little droplet on the end of the brush. Then you are going to apply it. I usually start on the anterior because just like with fingernail polish, that first little drop may have a little bit, more spread. And so I want to start with my bigger teeth. So I start on the central and move my way back. Then I do the next quadrant. It only takes about 10 seconds to dry. Do the next quadrant and then repeat the procedure on the mandibular. Once it's dried, you can lick it, you can touch it, you can have a drink. It doesn't matter because now that polymer is on the tooth holding the hydrogen peroxide up against the tooth. Then you are going to take the light device, turn it on, and wear that device for 10 minutes. We recommend that the patient do this at night before they go to bed. So they'll wear the device for 10 minutes. It will beep once at 5 minutes. It will beep twice at 10 minutes, and then it will turn itself off. Then you remove the device, rinse it off, dry it, and put it back in the charging station. We recommend that you charge it every single time. Then the patient can just go to sleep, and they can wear that overnight. And in the morning, they're going to need to brush off that dried film. Let's just talk quickly about some professional advantages. We know that during the pandemic, a lot of our patients have been sitting behind their computers like you are right now and on webinars. So they've been looking at their face the whole time, and they've been noticing all of the things that they want to change about their smiles. And now that a lot of people are getting vaccinated, they're wanting to take their mask off and kind of come back into society again. And so we're finding that there's actually a webinar effect, a pandemic effect. So patients are wanting their smiles aesthetically upgraded, and whitening, bleaching is a big part of that. As a matter of fact, they found that there's a huge uprise in cosmetic dentistry. And when they did a survey, they actually found that whitening was one of the top 4 things that patients wanted to do once they got back out of their homes and out of quarantine. So now is really the time to start talking to our patients about professional whitening. Patients are spending more, they're getting more appointments for whitening. The market is growing by leaps and bounds since the pandemic. So we really just need to keep it simple. And I know a lot of times dental professionals can be very uncomfortable talking about whitening with their patients because they feel like they're saying, oh, you have really ugly colored teeth. You want us to make them, better. But what you can do is you can utilize it if you have a morning huddle. I know for many years in my practice, we had a morning huddle where we would pull the charts of all the patients that were coming in that day, and we would discuss what their treatment was going to be, what their life experiences were. You know, maybe we had patients that were getting married soon, or that were getting a new job, or patients that were going to be starting with restorative work. You know, anytime that a patient is having anything done, especially on their anterior teeth, it's very, very important as dental professionals that we talk to them about whitening before we start with the restorative procedures. Because, you know, once we get that crown or the veneer or even a composite placed on those anteriors, the patients will be all excited, and then they'll say, oh, I love how my tooth looks now. Now I want to lighten my teeth. Well, we know it's too late by then, because, you know, those man-made materials just do not lighten. So it's very, very important that we discuss that with them prior to doing anterior aesthetic upgrades. So there's very easy ways to initiate the whitening discussion with your patients. You don't have to say, Mrs. Jones, you have really dark teeth. You can just ask your patients if there's anything that they would like to change about their smile. And I can guarantee that even if they have periodontal disease, even if they have a ton of decay, whatever the situation is, maybe they're missing teeth, they'll probably, one of the first things that they will start to talk about is wanting to whiten their teeth. So you can always take a shade at every appointment. You can show them what their shade is, discuss it. Are you happy with the color of your teeth? And then, of course, we want to manage those expectations like we talked about earlier. And please, please, please never promise a shade. I know a lot of times we see studies where it says, you know, in this study of 500 people, there was, you know, the average of this many shades. But you know what? Like I said, there's always those people who have either already lightened their teeth, either over the counter with previous bleaching, you know, modalities, and they are not get as light as somebody who has never bleached before, or maybe somebody who doesn't have tetracycline. I mean, there's so many different things, and then there's that small percentage of the population that don't bleach at all. So always under promise and then over deliver, because then your patients are going to be so happy with you, as opposed to over promising and under delivering. So the benefits to your office by utilizing this new technology is that it's fast. You're not having to make custom trays. You can send them home with it. You can show them right there in the chair if you want how to utilize it. It's designed for comfort and no sensitivity. You are not using a huge volume of hydrogen peroxide. You're not bathing the entire tooth in hydrogen peroxide. It's very precise placement, and it's a 6% hydrogen peroxide. That is concentrated or enhanced. It's very effective. You're going to get a good shade change within even 5 to 10 days, and there's no mess to clean up. I would once again like to thank Henry Schein for allowing me to speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marty, for your time this evening. And thank you to Colgate as well for sponsoring tonight's webinar. If anyone has additional questions on this topic, please feel free to email us at webinars@henryschein.com. Additionally, if you're interested in attending future Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. As a thank you for attending, everyone will receive the recording of this webinar via email in the next week. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.